Welcome back to the How to Start a Cannabis Farm podcast. My name is Jared, and I am your host. The background looks a little different today. I am in Texas doing a podcast in my sister's old room, my family's place in Texas. For those that don't know, I was recently offered a position on the Texas Hemp Advisory Council by the chair, Miss Eloise Frischkorn. She was appointed by the Commissioner of the Texas Department of Agriculture, Mr. Sid Miller, to provide information and direction to the department as Texas begins its first season growing hemp. Being born and raised in Texas, I was enthused, and I saw this as a great opportunity to help the state that birthed me. So I took the offer, and here I am. The advisory council's job is to discuss the tough issues and find solutions that are logical and economical, both on paper and in reality. Being one of the few people within this circle that have actually cultivated hemp for a couple years, I felt that it was my duty to help out as much as possible. Through the normal course of just discussing things, Eloise and I were talking about the different issues with genetics and how the unfortunate misinterpretation of the Hemp Act creates an unnecessary burden on Texas farmers. After polling Facebook and a couple other social media areas, we found that folks would love any insight that helps them make smarter purchases. So, that being said, brought to you by Eloise Frischkorn of THEO, also known as Texas Hemp Educational Organization, the Texas Hemp Advisory Council, mellowmoosefarms, Hemp Worldwide Farms, the How to Start a Cannabis Farm podcast, and of course the 2020 quarantine. Today's episode is all about choosing genetics, USDA testing, COAs, and shady producers. So, while this may not be the most expensive expenditure you'll have this season, it will be the difference between you succeeding and failing. Before we get into it, though, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So let's discuss total THC versus Delta 9. Total THC is an equation that represents the potential quantity of THC that may be consumed if smoking, vaping, or heating. The process is known as decarboxylation, or decarb for short, which is a chemical reaction in which the A from THCA gets released and leaves you with only THC. When you get a lab test done, the equation that's used for determining total THC looks like THCA times 0.877 plus Delta 9 THC. If you're looking for total CBD, it's the exact same, CBDA times 0.877 plus CBD. Now, to move forward, I wanted to talk about pilot program genetics versus USDA genetics, which is really discussing Delta 9 versus total THC. But to go a little bit further, your state's pilot program will determine, based on how hemp is defined and your own testing requirements, both pre-harvest and post-harvest, what genetics you can purchase. If you're a Delta 9 state, your choices are pretty much endless. The majority of genetics were bred in Delta 9 states. They were bred for the 0.3 threshold of Delta 9, not total THC. They were also bred for testing that allowed you to test 30 days prior to harvest. Unfortunately, many of the genetics that were used last year and the year before, they're not compliant under USDA guidelines. If you are cultivating in a Delta 9 state, though, what I found is that the higher terpene profiles are really what's flying through the market with some velocity. Personally, I've become a fan of the Bubba Kush hemp. There's a lot of it out there right now that's really bad. So make sure that you're actually taking the plants to their full potential and taking care of them at harvest and drying and curing. Don't just rush the process, because you're kind of ruining the name at that point. The Abacus and Abacus phenotypes are really solid. There's a lot of there's some diesels out there. There's a cheese and a cherry. If you're looking for some of the Abacus varieties, you can send me an email. We'll get that squared away. Same thing with the Bubba Kush. Now, Lifter is something that I've become a fan of over the years. In my opinion, it's probably the best bang for your buck seed, as far as having great percentages, being 19-20% if you actually take the plant to its full potential. Whereas if you're doing like a budget grow or trying to use as little fertilizer or nutrients as possible, you can pull in 16-17%, no problem. Plus it yields really well, and it's pretty damn stable. Now, if you're like the rest of the U.S. And you're planning for next season, you're gonna have to utilize the USDA genetics, which that's the point of concern at the moment. So again, USDA requirements that you get a pre-harvest test done 15 days prior to before you harvest. You have to harvest the top 2 inches of the plant. Most genetics were not tested to be compliant in the top 2 inches. And again, you have to test for total THC. Again, just to reiterate, the average pilot program requirements for pre-harvest testing were 30 days before harvest. You were usually testing the top 8 inches, or at least in Oregon. And the cannabinoids that you were testing were Delta 9, not total THC. Now, just to reiterate again, in relation to genetics, the issue is that most genetics they were bred and tested, and cultivated and bred again and tested again and cultivated again for pilot program requirements. So it becomes an issue even when COAs claim compliance, and I'll go into that a little bit further. There was one state that I recently spoke with a gentleman, actually a couple guys. Indiana, I believe last year, was testing the top 1 inch, but they were testing for Delta 9, and so it made it a little easier to stay compliant. But I asked him if any of them did stay compliant for total THC, and he said not one. And even the one that was close was pulled like 3 weeks early, maybe even earlier if I remember correctly. Anyways, in relation to COAs, the COAs that you get when you're going to purchase seeds, they don't tell you how many days before harvest the sample was tested at. So that's the concern, is if it was 30 days before harvest and it looks compliant, then if you're under USDA guidelines, you're not looking so good. They also don't tell you where the sample came from. Was it the bottom of the plant, the middle of the top 8 inches, top 3, top 2? A lot of COAs that I've been seeing recently also don't even have a picture. And to me, that's one of the biggest red flags that I've been finding, is no picture. Because first off, it could be photoshopped. Every COA that I've gotten outside of every COA I've gotten locally within Oregon, when I was there, they all had pictures of the samples. Now, the issue is that without a picture, you don't know if the sample was biomass or a ground up formula that the flower to stem to seed to leaf ratio was so off that it turned a non-compliant product into compliant. And so that's my concern. Now, many of these seed producers and folks, whether they're doing this purposely or not, if they are, they're in one of the blacklist groups on Facebook. There's a few of them, and I highly recommend, if you're not on Facebook, you get on it and you become part of these groups and you do your own research and ask for references. But one of the companies that I kind of caught doing this, I was interested in their products because of the marketing material that they produced. And it looked great. I mean, absolutely great stuff. 0.09% total THC, 14% CBD, 3-4 pound yields. It's like, well, that sounds like a unicorn. Okay, so I asked their sales rep to send me a little bit more information, and he sent me this big old packet. It was like fantastic. Tons of documentation, tons of this. Well, I get it all, and I start comparing the marketing material to the COAs. And I mean, stuff that said 0.09 on the marketing material was at 0.6 for total THC, meaning a 0.51% difference, which is super, super, super hot. I compared the five varieties I was interested in, and every single one of them was hot. And the CBD percentages, they weren't at 13, 14. They were at like 21, 22, 19, 17. And although I wasn't sure what to think, I asked the sales rep about it because, I was concerned. And he reached out to the higher ups, and they responded saying that their marketing material is meant to show farmers what could happen, not necessarily what the potential of the plant is. Now, to me, that seems a little misleading, because first-time farmers may not know to ask that question. You may end up, if I wasn't doing my due diligence, I may have just bought some genetics that claimed compliance, and then when I grow them out and try to grow the best stem hemp that I can grow, and all of a sudden it comes up 20% CBD, I'm excited, but the total THC is 0.6, and I have to burn, however many acres I decided to grow that year. I mean, if you decided to risk it all on 100 acres, I'm sorry, but you're done. And in reality, at what point are you going to not only sue the breeders, but that's a lot of money in order to follow them through court and deal with countersuits and still not be able to have any cash flow from your current harvest. Given the new USDA guidelines, there's not even remediation options. So we can't even get it all extracted and then just have them extract all the THC out of it. It's you're SOL. So moving forward, here's just a few things that I'd recommend you do, think, ask, and in general, just to give you kind of perspective on where my head is at. First, you have to think about where the seeds were bred and where they were cultivated. How similar is their environment to yours, and how is this going to affect THC? Remember, THC is usually produced as a stress response. So, for instance, in my specific scenario, all my genetics were bred in Oregon, and I can't grow those here in Texas because of the I can't grow them as my bread and butter in Texas because I'm aware that they will more than likely, outside of the total THC issues that they have currently, even the certain phenotypes that are compliant there, I'm still not confident in them being compliant here based on the stress responses that I anticipate happening. The next thing is a lot of seed producers and breeders. They may breed their stuff indoors or in greenhouses, away from the harshness of the world. I would make sure to question where they've tested. See if you can get pictures of their product out in the field. It's one thing to there's a lot of varieties, for instance, in the actual cannabis market that were cultivated in San Diego, and if you bring them up to Oregon, they just won't perform. There's going to be issues. The biggest thing I think most folks are thinking about is heat, drought, winds, and pest pressures. That could create a harsher life than what your cultivar is normally used to in its place of origin. Next, again, cross-reference the marketing material with the alleged percentages of the COAs. Doing so hopefully will lead you down a good path of not being taken advantage of. Now, this is my opinion because of the risk-reward scenario that we're presented with. And you can take your own risks. This is why I'm saying be cautious of this. I'm not saying don't do it, but be cautious of COAs that have a 0.2% total THC percent and above. So 0.2, 0.21, 0.22, and so on. I have COAs for my own varieties that are like 0.299. I won't plant those here in Texas. If their COA was cherry picked as the compliant one, it's reasonable to assume, and I'm utilizing my own data for this, that the actual total THC could be 0.3 or higher, especially depending on the environmental pressures that this specific cultivar will be subject to moving from its place of origin to its place of cultivation, your state. Again, I don't want to risk something on a 0.1%. We're already fighting an uphill battle. Now, that being said, I just won't make that cultivar my bread and butter either. It will be something off to the side that, if it happens, I don't lose too much. If the payoff is worth it, if the terpene profile is absolutely amazing, and you think for the flower market, it's an absolute win, well, maybe you take the risk. But if you're growing for biomass or cannabinoid production, I would be cautious, because, that's, in terms of our threshold being 0.3%, there's a 33% chance you could be over that mark at a 0.2% limit. And even then, that's a big risk for me. The next thing I would recommend is asking for multiple COAs. Now, ideally, multiple stages of growth from multiple plants. I understand not everybody is that diligent. I understand everybody doesn't really care that much. But just see what you can get. Ideally, something from week 4, week 5, week 6, September 15th, October 1st, October 15th, maybe even day 42 of flowering, day 49, day 56. It's just better to know the possible spectrum and how much you can push the limits. If something's going to be 0.3% total THC, you can almost bet that there's going to be something that's going to be a little hot. You're just wanting the spectrum to be closer to the lower end so that you're compliant. We're still dealing with plants, and right now, again, because most genetics weren't bred for the total THC threshold, we're fighting an uphill battle. As I previously mentioned, make sure your COAs have a picture of the sample. Again, this is just to make sure that you aren't looking at a biomass sample or something that may have been tampered with for compliance purposes. Really, though, the first thing that you should do when you get the COA is to look on there, get the lab number, and call them up and ask them to verify the lab report with you. You can read them the sample number. You can make sure all the cannabinoids have the correct numbers. You can make sure the graph or the little pictorial or whatever on the lab test matches the numbers. Even talk to them about the picture. Make sure the picture matches what they have. So your COA has flowers. Make sure that theirs doesn't have just a biomass sample and they photoshopped it. Make sure that just everything looks right. Again, if there's no picture and you can't verify what the sample actually looked like, for me, I move on, because it's too easy to manipulate the sample. It's just too easy. Now, if all looks good with the COA, ask the breeder or the sales rep what day or week your plants need to be tested and harvested to obtain these numbers. Going back to the seed producer that had the conflicting marketing material and COAs, if he would have put on the marketing material, harvest 3 weeks early, okay, great. I know that there's potential for more. But it also almost increases the value of those genetics, because when you can have access to Delta 9 testing, now you know that the potential of these genetics are much more. And you could say that they're dual purpose, but at the same time, it also means that to be compliant means that you're going to have premature product. And so compliant flower may not necessarily be good if it's premature and you're focusing on the flower market. It's great for cannabinoid production, absolutely great. Horrible for flower market though. Nobody wants premature flower. It's like having a rose, but you bought the bud and not the flower. Almost there. Let's see, what else? If you're buying feminized seeds, ask them for a fem report or some sort of percentage, ideally, of the seeds that will be female. This should be as close to 99% as possible. Now, if you're dealing with a small breeder, it may not be cost effective. That's just because the cost of getting it done, or maybe the sample size required too many seeds, and the plant that they were dealing with just didn't produce that much. Not everybody does this on mass scale, but many of the big boys do. Ask them for a germ report or a germination report. That should also be the percentage of seeds in a given sample that should germinate under a given scenario. This should also be as close to 99% as possible. Again, it may not be cost effective for small breeders just due to the sample size requirements or the cost of the actual test. Other seed labeling requirements may be required based on the USDA or your state's agricultural department. Whether, the things like testing for inert matter or testing for weed seeds, things like that. If you're purchasing from a small breeder, take this into consideration and proceed as you see fit. A lot of small breeders, or a lot of people buy from small breeders because they're the only ones that will provide breeding and propagation rights with their genetics. A lot of the big guys don't, and they require you to sign all sorts of contracts. And so if you are purchasing from a small breeder, and we all start from somewhere, don't bet the farm on the seeds without proper documentation. It's okay to have your bread and butter, but seeds without proper documentation, maybe just plant a small amount. Just a little mac and cheese, not the whole bowl. Even then, though, it would be better, especially for compliance purposes, to buy properly labeled seeds with all the required information that your Department of Agriculture requires. If you plan on breeding with the genetics, and again, bringing that up with the small breeders, they will be more likely to release genetics with propagation and breeding rights. However, there are a ton of other questions that you can ask, and breeding is an entirely different topic altogether. And so we'll have to cover that another time. Now, I would definitely ask if they have any guarantees, warranties, policies, or programs available. For instance, if you follow their germination protocols, will they replace bad seed? Is there any buyback programs? Or if they follow a prescribed growing method, will they buy back? Are there any sharecropping programs or something similar to heavily discounted seed or free seed up front for maybe 10 or 20% of your harvest at the end of the day? Is there any free COAs or free testing provided throughout the grow cycle just to make sure that you stay compliant? Another thing that I would just kind of think about is whether or not you should grow CBG, CBD, CBC, or any other novel cannabinoid chemotype. The short answer, again, my opinion, I would grow CBD varieties for terpene profiles. There are better terpene profiles within the CBD chemotype at the moment, although the issue is compliance. Now, for compliance and total THC concerns, I would be growing CBG. CBG, being a precursor to other cannabinoids, has a much higher chance of staying compliant, although it still can go over depending on the actual variety. If you need CBG varieties, I can help with that. Just send me an email, we'll get it taken care of. Now, if you're growing for biomass, cannabinoid production, etc., CBG, CBC, CBDV. Now, I'm not necessarily sure what the market's going to do with the excess cannabinoids that are going to be produced because the market itself hasn't grown to meet the capacity of the industry yet. And I think a lot of that is just because of greed, but also people aren't as creative as we need at the moment. On the retail side, there's so many of the same product and so little innovation that the trend is to follow the newest trend. That's it. So be cautious when you're growing for CBG, CBC, CBD. I mean, there may be good margins on it now, but it's still going to be tough. But if you decide you want even CBC, I think actually I got a buddy of mine that I think has access to clones in Oregon. So just give me a shout if you need those. Now, I think one of the, at least here in Texas, one of the biggest concerns for the season has been, what if I don't get my license in time? Because we have a 60-day window just to get our license, and I'm estimating at least 30 days for our lot permit. License allows you to grow. The lot permit is for specifically which genetic you're growing where. So greenhouse 1, all of your, CBG, that would require a separate lot permit compared to your CBD genetics and compared to your CBC. So if you apply late and you get your license by July or August, don't worry, you can still get a crop in. You can get a decent harvest, but I have to admit, you got to be about the hustle. You have to be about the work, and you have to prepare as much as possible. You may have to use supplemental lighting, and I know there's concern for, well, how do I do supplemental lighting on 10 acres, 20 acres, just acres? It can be done. It's been done forever. I mean, this industry is not new. It's just new to some people. So my recommendation is to hire a consultant and pay them for their experiences. If you don't know how to do this, ask somebody. This information isn't free, and it does take a lot of time and money to learn things. And so in the same way that you would want your kid to go to college for an education, you should pay for an education or take the time to learn it yourself. You can also grow autoflowers, and I feel autoflowers are the best idea for most folks in general. I was waking up at 4 a.m. pulling light depth tarps all last year, and let me tell you, I'm looking forward to growing autoflowers this year. It's nice being able to sleep in, but at the same time, you still get a super head start waking up at 4 a.m. and doing stuff. But the beauty about autoflowers is the fact that you don't have to rely on the photo period in order to get a harvest. They will flower out based on their own maturity. The beauty of them is you can also get fresh product pretty much throughout the season, which has been one of the benefits for light depth. The genetics do need a little bit of work. I can find super quality autoflower genetics from a buddy of mine in Eugene. So again, if you need access to those, feel free to send me an email. We'll get you squared away. He definitely has the best autoflowers in the hemp market, in my opinion. But if you're trying to produce, a product earlier in the year, then and still use non-autoflower genetics, you're going to have to light depth. There's no way around that at the moment. Now, planting in July and August. So, in Oregon, folks don't really plant super early in the ground because of the soil temperature. Now, usually people are planting June 1st. You can push it earlier. It's just sometimes you may get rained on, buckets and buckets. You may get a late snow, a late freeze, and that happens. Here in Texas, the concern is more about the soil temperature being a little too hot, your area being too dry, or you not having a reason to keep the ground wet because there's no plants. And so when you decide to plant, or maybe because you tilled extremely early, all that subsoil moisture is now evaporating, and unfortunately, you're slowly killing the surface microbes, the subsoil microbes, and you're just destroying your soil. There are things you can do to mitigate some of that. There are steps you can take if you plan on doing a late planting. You can continue building your soil, but again, I would reach out to a consultant if you're worried about anything. Don't think that you got it and you're going to wing it, and you end up putting your plants in the ground and the soil's too hot and you burn everything up. Or you think that you can get away watering less than you should and all your stuff dies. Even if you're worried about planting, 10 acres and, it's July, August, scale it back to 1. It's better to learn something and lose a little than to get greedy and just try to plant it all and lose your ass. Other than that, I'd like to thank Eloise Frischkorn for giving me the opportunity to hop on the Texas Hemp Advisory Council. This episode of the How to Start a Cannabis Farm podcast has been brought to you by THEO, also known as the Texas Hemp Educational Organization. You can, to receive updates and newsletters and hemp news, you can join the Texas Hemp Educational Organization at jointheo, THEO.org. Again, jointheo.org. This episode has also been brought to you by the Texas Hemp Advisory Council, Mellow Moose Farms, Hemp Worldwide Farms, and again, the 2020 quarantine. That's it. If I missed something, if you just want to show some love for the movement, for what we're trying to do for Texas, for Oregon, for whomever, leave a comment, send me an email, reach out to me. I'll throw a few ways in the description to support us. Otherwise, I appreciate your time, stay safe, and thanks for listening.